All right, what is going on? Welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we check out great theories, concepts, and discoveries that you might not know about because they've been suppressed or otherwise difficult and or esoteric, and um, a lot of times they come from the result of lifelong research um, by people, and they end up putting out their magnum opus at the end, and nobody recognizes it, and nobody pays them. And so these people are my heroes. This segment is called Bible Decode. This is number 502. And we've looked into many different aspects of the New Testament. And today we're going to check out another segment from James Valliant and C.W. Fahy's Creating Christ. And this presents the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. Um, it's kind of grounded in the idea that the early Christians, for the first 2 or 3 centuries prior to Emperor Constantine, their major symbol was not the cross, but it was the anchor, um, a dolphin wrapped around an anchor, a fish, but it's actually a dolphin wrapped around an anchor. And they ended up discovering uh, coins that were issued in the millions by Emperor Titus of the Romans, in uh, who was who was emperor from 79 until 81 A.D., which happens to be the very time that the Gospels were being written. And his coins have a dolphin wrapped around an anchor on the backside, and Titus on the front, or heads, And so they're kind of fleshing that out. Um, Now, the first thing that they have to deal with here is uh, use the title of the Candida Moss book, The Myth of Persecution, because that's right where Christians will go. Well, no, the Romans couldn't have written the New Testament because, they were the persecutors of Christians. Um, Christians versus lions and everything. But that is very much misunderstood. Um, it was really what you would call Jewish Christians. They were persecuting Jews who kind of got lumped in with the Christians because there was a semi-permeable membrane there in the first century. Because, and this is what a lot of the book of Acts, a lot of the Pauline epistles, and some of Jesus's gospels also, are addressed. You know, well, if we're, following you, what's going on with the circumcision and the kosher food laws and the observance of the Sabbath and um, the strictures against graven images? These are the Jewish traditions and rituals that uh, some Christians wanted to hold fast to, and some of them were just like, no, because we are searching for, a wider audience, and like, you know, we don't we don't need to have everybody be circumcised, things like that. And so now, uh, in the last episode, we just got done reading a letter from Pliny the Younger, who is a very high up Roman royal, who at this time was the governor of Bithynia, a province in what is now Turkey. And he wrote this, I believe it was 112 or so AD. And he wrote a letter to Emperor uh, Trajan, who was emperor at this time. And, he asked Trajan a bunch of questions about these Christians. What am I supposed to do with them? Am I supposed to put them to death? Am I supposed to let them off? How am I supposed to decide? Um, you know, if, the Romans were very tolerant of religion, everybody's religion. They had hundreds of different tribes and nations under their empire, but they wanted you to also give a nod to Caesar at the same time. And that's where they got into all of these conflicts with the Jews, because the Jews were monotheistic and they believed that, to, uh, and they believed in strictures against graven images. And so, for example, when Emperor Caligula wanted to, in 37 to 41 AD, when he wanted to put a statue of himself into the Jewish temple, the Jews were ready to go to war over it. And actually, Caligula kind of relented on that and carved out an exception for the Jews. Um, and and so I think Caligula was eventually assassinated before he was able to like kind of uh, uh, exercise his wrath upon the Jews. But anyway, that's just a symbol for how um, the the Jews were more difficult for the Romans to deal with than any other people that they had, because everybody else was kind of polytheistic, so they could follow their own religion and salute Caesar at the same time. So that's kind of where we are right now. So let's start a passage from here. Any sacrifice or prayer in the presence of pagan images would have been a form of idol worship forbidden in the Hebrew scripture, according to including the Ten Commandments, Ten Commandments' famous prohibition against making or bowing down to the graven images of polytheistic deities. In this way, Gentile Christians could be detected immediately, Pliny presumes. Jews had been exempted from the requirement to worship Roman state deities. That's what I was talking about with the Caligula. Jews had been exempted from the requirement to worship state deities. However, as such worship was required of Roman citizens and officials, the failure to do so restricted their social mobility within the Roman world. It's unclear, however, whether these early New Testament Christians would have had the same problems, since we now know they were already using both symbolic representations of the divine and pagan religious images themselves. Even images related to pagan gods like Apollo, as the examples of Saint Clement of Alexandria demonstrate. Because this dolphin and anchor motif goes back earlier than the Caesars. It goes back to a bunch of other um, pagan symbolic um, systems way before Jesus, such as the god Apollo, and I think Seleucus as well, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals, who was a Syrian Greek who took over Judea in about 300 early third century BC. So Now we look at Trajan's reply to, to Pliny's letter, reassures the governor that he acted wisely by consulting him about the treatment of Christians, and that he has ruled appropriately. He directs Pliny that Christians need only offer prayer with incense and wine to Caesar in order to acquit themselves. Emperor Trajan does not require Christians to recognize Caesar's divinity, but merely to make an offering to the divine for Caesar's well-being. So that's pretty low bar. That doesn't sound like the Romans are going out of their way to persecute Christians. That all they have to do is basically just give a nod to Caesar, and they're not uh, you know um, abiding by the Jewish scriptures, their strictures against graven images and so on. So, and while the offensive images of pagan gods would be present, their official offering would not require an animal sacrifice of any kind. Above all, Christians are not to be hunted down, but ignored as much as possible. The official imperial attitude toward Christians, even as this earliest record shows, is actually rather benign and consistent with the policy of religious tolerance, usually favored by the Romans. Pliny's letter also tells us that the Christian movement was at least 20 years old in 111 or 112 AD. This is most interesting because it dates the existence of Christianity in Bithynia to the time of the Flavian Roman emperors who preceded Trajan. The Flavian emperors, that's Titus, he was the middle of the three Flavian emperors. His father, Vespasian, was ruled from 69 to 79, and his younger brother, Domitian, ruled from 81 to 96 AD. So the whole Flavian dynasty was 69 until 96. So that was the period that the Gospels were written. Uh, with the possible exception of John, which is maybe written a little bit later. Um, Now, there are people that think that Mark was written a little bit earlier, or that even that John was written much earlier. But most scholars believe that the Gospels were written between 70 and 100 AD. What else does this oldest surviving discussion of Christianity by Roman officials reveal? Pliny states that Christianity's popularity seems to have waned since the Flavian era. He also mentions that the Christians he is dealing with, even at this early stage of Christian history, appear to come from all classes of Roman society. All of these facts challenge the conventional view of Christian history. Now, um, to be a little bit more critical here, um, uh, you, I think that both Valliant and Fahy here are a little bit naive about their dealings with ancient texts. Um, the Romans had a complete monopoly over publishing, distribution, and um, censorship in their empire. And they wrote uh, in codes and with different levels of meaning. And so they've kind of ferreted out the superficial level of meaning, of the textual level of meaning of this correspondence between Pliny and Trajan. But um, there are deeper levels, um, and what I think I've learned from studying this stuff is the first thing is that you can't trust any of these texts, to be telling you the truth about anything. And I think that there are certainly Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin would also agree to say that the fact that Pliny states that Christianity's popularity has waned since the Flavian era is is that doesn't mean that that's true. Um, my my take on it is that Christianity never was popular until Constantine came along in the fourth century. They the Romans tried to get Christianity off the ground with this propaganda campaign in the Gospels, and the Gospels were performed as a play, as plays in front of audiences of illiterate, hoi pollois, the soldiers and the slaves, as well as the Jewish zealots. Um, but it never really got off the ground. And so all of this banter between Pliny and Trajan and the church fathers like Justin Martyr, um, Tertullian, these early church fathers, they also kind of wrote about Origen. They wrote about different scandals or different disputes or controversies within Christianity at this early period. All of these people are also the Romans. And so they're just creating drama, making it look like Christianity is a legitimate thing at this time, but it really isn't. That's my take on it. So, um, and that comes from a lot of deciphering. Uh, they play a shell game of names, and so Pliny actually writes under several other uh, pseudonyms, and you have to, including other people that you like, Saint Ignatius. Saint Ignatius is Pliny. And you can figure that out when you read his letters and kind of uh, read where he says he is at a certain time, and um, then look into the history of Saint Ignatius, and he was there at that same time, and these kind of things. You have to it requires like a detective type work as opposed to just historical research. Okay, back to the text here. Pliny also reveals that the traditional or established forms of Roman worship became entirely deserted at one time in the recent past, but that they were now staging a comeback. Even at in this report, even if this report is exaggerated. Now he says exaggerated, but I would say flat out fabricated. But he says even if this report is exaggerated, a great many people, it seems, had gotten over a Christian phase that had peaked and started fading during the reign of the Flavian Emperor Domitian, who succeeded his father Vespasian and brother Titus. The archaeological evidence tells us that the coin issued by Titus that mirrors the first symbol of Christ was discontinued by his brother Domitian only a few months into his reign. Titus ruled for only 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days, yet he had managed to issue millions of coins bearing that symbol during this brief reign. His younger brother Domitian ruled for 15 years and was known to have conducted a harsh purge of the upper class, even executing and banishing some of his own family members, who, as we shall see, may have been Christians. Okay, so that is an exception. Domitian did uh, persecute some Christians, but it was kind of like they just happened to have been Christians. He was persecuting him because they were his family members, um, and he felt like he was paranoid. He felt like they were trying to plot an assassination against him and so on. So it wasn't because that they were Christians, per se, that they were persecuted, but they were, including his nephew-in-law Titus Flavius Clemens, otherwise known as Clement of Rome, and his niece, the aforementioned Domitilla, otherwise known as the founder of the catacombs there in Rome. He even the Christian catacombs. He even adopted their children as his own heirs, as Titus and Domitilla were married. What is most vivid in this early correspondence between the Emperor Trajan and Pliny the Younger is the contrast between imperial Rome's careful policy toward the new Christian religion on the one hand and its violent suppression of militant Messianic Judaism on the other. And that's where the confusion lies. Outside the New Testament itself, and possibly the writings ascribed to St. Clement of Rome, St. Ignatius of Antioch, and Papias of Hierapolis. Papias was also, I believe, a pseudonym of one of the Romans. This correspondence is the earliest primary evidence of Christianity that exists anywhere in the historical record. Um, with one controversial exception that we will examine in detail in part 2. Among the earliest surviving mentions of Christianity, we have an official statement of how the Roman Empire will not persecute Christians, written by the Roman Emperor himself. The evidence from almost the whole of the 2 centuries that follow conforms to Emperor Trajan's quasi-toleration of Christians. His approach seems to have become the standard operating policy of the Roman government toward Christianity, despite later fictional depictions of Roman mistreatment of Christians. So, what is the basis for the assertion that Christians were being systematically hunted down and slaughtered by Romans as early as the 1st century, as we have been led to believe by tradition, books, movies, and popular culture? The answer turns out to be a key to understanding what has been most puzzling um, Christian scholars, most puzzling to Christian scholars for centuries. According to the famous account of the 2nd century historian Tacitus, another one of these Roman royals, Nero, the notorious 1st century emperor, who was emperor from 54 until 68 BC, AD. Nero, the notorious 1st century emperor, tried to pin the blame for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD on Christians, quote, Christians. In the Annals, which is Tacitus's books of history, in the Annals, Tacitus writes, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and all the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort, not so much, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good but to glut one's own cruelty that they were being destroyed. Again, I just you have to take all of that with more than a grain of salt. Um, you know, you can't trust anything that Tacitus says, in my opinion. That is straight propaganda. Okay, such a characterization of Christians, criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment by a Roman senator and historian like Tacitus, makes no sense if we understand the term Christian in the sense of gospel believing, tax paying citizens who render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and turn the other cheek while walking the extra mile for the Romans. Who then are these criminals Tacitus describes Nero as vilifying? We must remember that by the year 64 AD, when the Great Fire decimated the city of Rome, the Gospels themselves had not been written yet. They would not be written until the Flavian era that followed Nero. The great majority of mainstream scholars, both Christian and non Christian, agree on this dating. There is simply no reason to think that many people in Rome had ever heard of this kind of Caesar friendly Christianity only 3 decades or so after the crucifixion. So few in number could such Christians have been, especially in the city of Rome, that it is exceedingly unlikely that these ostensibly peace loving followers of New Testament ideals could have made a convincing or useful scapegoat for Nero. So, who could Nero have been blaming, and who could Tacitus be describing? The mystery is resolved if Tacitus is confusing one group of devotees of a Jewish Messiah with another group who were indeed creating very serious trouble for the Roman government and were in fact quite active in Rome at that time. Rebellion had been simmering among Jews since the days of the first Roman census in the early first century, and the new imperial tax that this census was designed to impose on them. These are events that the Gospel of Luke associates with the birth of Jesus, and they also signal the birth of the Jewish rebellion, according to the ancient historian Flavius Josephus, who you absolutely can't trust. According to all ancient sources, it was the galvanizing concept of the Messiah, a warrior who would lead the Jews to salvation, that most motivated the revolt against Roman masters, however unlikely they were to succeed. Okay, I think I'm going to stop right there, and there seems to be a decent opportunity to make a transition for later, and we're well in this video. So we will return tomorrow and resume at this location. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and come back tomorrow for another episode of Bible Decode. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.